In 2023, a geological survey team drilling near an abandoned mine in Montana made a discovery that defied every law of physics they knew. Ground-penetrating radar showed human figures moving upward through solid granite, ascending from depths that should have crushed any living thing decades ago. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. When they analyzed the movement patterns, they realized these figures were climbing toward the surface at a rate of exactly 3 feet per day, and according to their calculations, they would breach the ground in less than 2 weeks. The mine had been sealed since 1943 after a cave-in trapped 37 workers. Their bodies never recovered. What the survey team discovered next would make them question everything they believed about death, about what lies beneath our feet, and about the true reason some mines stay abandoned forever. But this is just one of 7 mysteries that will make you never look at abandoned mines the same way again. From the Pennsylvania shaft, where murder victims are found wearing clothes from the 1920s, with DNA linking them to families that vanished during the original mining operation, to the Nevada mine that's been transmitting cell phone signals from depths where no human could survive, each story reveals something more disturbing than the last. Security cameras have captured full mining crews working night shifts in mines that were supposedly shut down decades ago, with equipment running that was scrapped years ago. In Colorado, bodies spanning 40 years have been discovered in mine shafts, all showing identical preservation methods that suggest a killer with impossible longevity and underground knowledge that defies explanation. And then there's the discovery that changed everything. The mine walls in Iron Mountain that literally pulse and breathe, revealing a massive underground organism that forensic evidence suggests has been feeding on trapped miners for over a century. But perhaps the most chilling mystery involves the famous burning coal mine of Centralia, where investigation teams report hearing distinct human voices calling for help from impossible depths. Voices that led to the discovery of mining records showing workers who never officially existed, people who, according to all documentation, were never born. Tonight, I'm taking you deep into these 7 true mysteries that authorities still can't explain, stories that will make you understand why some places are meant to stay buried. Click the subscribe button and hit that bell icon, because once you hear these stories, you'll want to know about every mystery we uncover. These aren't just abandoned mines, they're gateways to horrors that were never meant to see daylight again. Story 1. Marcus Chen had been a geological surveyor for 15 years, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what he discovered beneath the burning streets of Centralia, Pennsylvania, in March of 2023. The coal mine fire that had been raging underground since 1962 was finally showing signs of cooling in certain sections, and the state had commissioned Chen's team to assess structural damage for potential reclamation efforts. What they found instead would haunt Chen for the rest of his life and force authorities to seal off entire sections of the town that had remained accessible for decades. Chen's initial descent into the cooled sections of the mine was routine, his equipment detecting the expected heat signatures and structural damage from 60 years of underground burning. But as he moved deeper into the tunnel system, his audio equipment began picking up something that made his blood run cold. Distinct human voices calling for help from depths that should have been impossible to survive. The voices weren't echoes or distortions from the surface. They were clear, desperate pleas coming from sections of the mine that had been completely cut off by cave-ins decades earlier. Deputy Rebecca Torres of the Pennsylvania State Police had seen her share of strange cases, but when Chen's report crossed her desk, she initially dismissed it as hallucinations caused by carbon monoxide exposure. However, Chen's audio recordings were undeniable. Multiple voices, both male and female, calling out names and asking for rescue from locations that, according to all mining records, had been inaccessible since the early 1980s. Torres assembled a specialized rescue team equipped with the latest thermal imaging and communication equipment, determined to either debunk Chen's claims or mount the most important rescue operation in Pennsylvania's history. What they discovered during their descent challenged everything they thought they knew about the Centralia disaster and the true number of people who had been lost to the underground inferno. The rescue team's thermal imaging equipment detected human heat signatures at depths of over 800 feet, in sections where the temperature should have been lethal and oxygen levels non-existent. More disturbing was the pattern of the heat signatures. They weren't moving randomly or showing signs of distress, but instead appeared to be organized in groups, almost as if they were conducting some kind of systematic activity in the darkness. When the team attempted to establish radio contact with the voices, the responses they received made them question their own sanity. The people calling back identified themselves using names that matched missing persons reports from not just the 1960s mine fire, but from disappearances spanning back to the 1920s, when the original mine was still in active operation. These voices claimed to have been waiting for rescue for decades, describing an underground community that had somehow survived in the depths, sustained by methods they refused to explain over the radio. Torres made the decision to send a single specialist, equipped with the most advanced life support and communication systems available, to make physical contact with whoever was calling from the depths. What happened next defied every protocol and safety measure they had in place. The specialist, Officer James Wright, descended to the 800-foot level and established visual contact with figures in the darkness, figures that appeared to be wearing mining equipment from different eras, some with helmets and gear that hadn't been used in coal mines for over 50 years. Wright's body camera recorded their faces, and what Torres saw in the footage made her immediately order the evacuation of the entire rescue team. The people Wright encountered weren't just survivors. They showed no signs of the smoke damage, malnutrition, or psychological trauma that would be expected from decades of underground isolation. Their skin was pale but healthy, their eyes bright and alert, and most terrifyingly, they seemed to know Wright was coming before he even reached their level. The conversation Wright had with these underground survivors was recorded in full, and the transcript remains classified by Pennsylvania state authorities to this day. However, leaked portions reveal that these people claimed to have been selected for survival by something they referred to only as the Burning Guardian, an entity they insisted had been living in the deepest parts of the mine long before coal extraction ever began. They described a vast underground ecosystem that existed in the spaces between the burning coal seams, where the fire itself served as both protection and sustenance for something that had been feeding on human consciousness for over a century. According to their testimony, the mine fire hadn't been an accident at all, but a deliberate act to awaken and feed this ancient presence that required both heat and human minds to survive. When Wright attempted to convince some of the survivors to return to the surface with him, their response chilled him to the bone. They explained that they couldn't leave because they were no longer entirely human. The Burning Guardian had changed them, made them part of its underground network of consciousness. They claimed that everyone who had ever truly disappeared in Centralia hadn't died in the fire, but had been absorbed into this collective, their individual minds becoming nodes in a vast underground intelligence that grew stronger with each person it claimed. They warned Wright that by coming down to their level, he had already been marked, and that the Burning Guardian was now aware of the rescue team's presence on the surface. Wright's final transmission was a panicked report that the tunnel walls around him were beginning to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the coal fire, and that he could feel something vast and ancient focusing its attention on him. His body camera showed the underground survivors backing away from him with expressions of sympathy, as if they knew what was about to happen. The last image transmitted showed Wright's face reflected in what appeared to be a smooth black surface that hadn't been there moments before, a surface that seemed to be moving, reaching out toward the camera. Then all communication ceased, and Wright's life signs flatlined simultaneously across all monitoring equipment. The rescue team's immediate attempt to retrieve Wright's body revealed that the tunnel he had descended through no longer existed. Solid rock had somehow filled the space completely, as if the mine shaft had never been carved in the first place. Geological surveys conducted afterward showed no evidence that anyone had ever been at the 800-foot level, despite hours of recorded communication and video evidence. Even more disturbing, thermal imaging no longer detected any human heat signatures in the deep sections of the mine, as if the underground community had simply vanished the moment Wright's transmission ended. The only trace left of the entire incident was Wright's equipment, found scattered on the surface near the mine entrance, melted and twisted into shapes that suggested exposure to temperatures far exceeding anything the coal fire could have produced. Torres was forced to file a report that Wright had died in a structural collapse, but the classified portions of her investigation tell a different story. Audio analysis of the final transmissions revealed that Wright's voice had begun to change in his last moments, taking on the same tonal qualities as the underground survivors, as if he was already becoming part of whatever collective consciousness existed in the depths. Most terrifying of all, ongoing monitoring equipment installed around Centralia continues to pick up Wright's voice among the others calling from the deep tunnels, now identifying himself as part of the Burning Guardians network and warning other potential rescuers to stay away. The voices from the depths of Centralia still call out on quiet nights, but now they're not asking for rescue. They're extending invitations to join them in the darkness, where the Burning Guardian waits to welcome new minds into its ever-growing underground consciousness. Story 2. Elena Vasquez had inspected mining operations across 3 states during her 12-year career as a federal safety inspector, but the assignment that brought her to Bingham Canyon, Utah in September 2023 was unlike anything she had encountered before. The massive open-pit copper mine had been officially closed for environmental remediation since 2019, yet security reports from the past 6 months described impossible activity, full mining crews working night shifts with heavy equipment that had supposedly been dismantled and sold for scrap years earlier. The mining company insisted these reports were false alarms caused by automated systems malfunctioning, but when Elena arrived to conduct her investigation, she discovered evidence that would challenge everything she believed about time, reality, and the true cost of industrial mining operations. Tommy "Gear" Richardson had worked as an equipment operator at Bingham Canyon for over 20 years before the closure, and he knew every piece of machinery in that pit like they were extensions of his own body. When the company hired him as a security consultant to help Elena investigate the mysterious activity reports, Tommy was certain they would find nothing more than faulty motion sensors and maybe some scavengers looking for leftover copper wire. However, the first night of their surveillance revealed something that made Tommy question his own memories of the mine's final days. From their observation post on the canyon rim, they watched as massive haul trucks that Tommy remembered personally driving to the scrapyard began moving along routes that had been permanently blocked by environmental barriers. The trucks were following the exact shift patterns from the mine's operational days, complete with proper safety protocols and coordination that would have required dozens of experienced workers to execute. Elena's initial assumption was that someone had illegally reactivated portions of the mining operation, perhaps using stolen or rebuilt equipment to extract remaining copper deposits. However, when she and Tommy descended into the pit the following morning to investigate, they found no fresh tire tracks, fuel residue, or any other evidence that heavy machinery had been operating in the area. The environmental barriers were still intact and undisturbed. The access roads remained blocked by concrete barriers that would have required industrial equipment to move, and, most puzzling of all, the soil analysis showed no recent disturbance despite clear video evidence of massive trucks moving tons of material during the night shift. Elena began to suspect they were dealing with something far more complex than simple illegal mining activity. The breakthrough came when Elena decided to review the mine's historical security footage, comparing the current mysterious activity with archived recordings from the facility's operational period. What she discovered made her hands shake as she analyzed. The data the night shift crews captured on recent security cameras weren't just following the same patterns as historical operations. They were identical to specific shifts that had worked the mine between 2016 and 2018. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed that individual workers visible in the recent footage matched exactly with personnel records from those years, wearing the same clothes, using the same equipment, and even displaying the same personal mannerisms and safety habits that supervisors had noted in their evaluation reports. It was as if somehow the mine's final years of operation were being replayed with perfect accuracy every night, regardless of the fact that the facility had been abandoned and the workers had moved on to other jobs across the country. Tommy's reaction to Elena's discovery was immediate and visceral terror, because he recognized himself among the phantom workers in the recent footage. The security cameras had captured him operating haul truck 47, following the exact route and timing from a specific shift he had worked on March 15, 2018. A shift he remembered clearly because it had been his birthday, and his crew had surprised him with cake during the lunch break. In the recent footage, Phantom Tommy was making all the same stops, following all the same procedures, and even pausing at the exact moments where he had originally stopped to adjust his mirrors or check his load. Most disturbing of all, the footage showed Phantom Tommy looking directly at the security camera and waving at precisely 11:47 p.m., exactly as he had done on that March night 5 years earlier when he had spotted the camera's red recording light. Elena's investigation revealed that the phantom night shifts weren't random replays, but were systematically working through the mine's final 2 years of operation in chronological order. Each night, the ghostly crew would reenact a different historical shift, complete with the same productivity numbers, safety incidents, and equipment malfunctions that had been recorded in the original operational logs. The pattern suggested that something was methodically reliving every moment of the mine's final period, as if the industrial activity itself had somehow been absorbed into the landscape and was now playing back like a recording trapped in an endless loop. However, Elena's detailed analysis revealed subtle differences in each replay. The phantom workers were becoming more aware of their situation with each iteration, occasionally looking directly at modern security cameras that hadn't existed during their original shifts, and displaying signs of distress that hadn't been present in the historical footage. The true horror of the situation became apparent when Elena realized that the phantom night shifts were progressing toward the mine's official closure date of December 31, 2019. According to her calculations, the ghostly reenactments would reach that final day within 3 weeks of her investigation, and she had no way of predicting what would happen when the phantom workers reached the end of their timeline. Tommy became increasingly agitated as the investigation continued, reporting that he was experiencing vivid dreams where he was simultaneously present as both his current self and his phantom counterpart, watching himself work shifts that he knew he had already completed years ago. He described a growing sense that something was trying to pull him back into the mine, to complete the cycle and join his phantom self in the eternal replay of those final operational years. Elena's worst fears were confirmed when she discovered that 3 former Bingham Canyon employees had gone missing in the past month, all of them individuals who appeared prominently in the phantom night shift footage. Security cameras at their homes showed them leaving in the middle of the night, walking with the purposeful stride of workers heading to their shifts, carrying lunchboxes and wearing mining gear that they shouldn't have still possessed. Their families reported that in the days before their disappearances, these men had been talking obsessively about unfinished work at the mine, about shifts they needed to complete and quotas they had failed to meet. Most chilling of all, the phantom night shift footage from the nights following their disappearances showed these missing workers appearing among the ghostly crew, no longer replaying historical shifts but performing entirely new work, as if they had become permanently integrated into whatever force was driving the endless cycle of phantom mining operations. Tommy's final night as Elena's security consultant ended with him walking into the pit at 11:30 p.m., carrying his original lunchbox and wearing his old Bingham Canyon hard hat that he swore he had thrown away years earlier. Elena watched from the observation post as Tommy approached haul truck 47, which materialized out of thin air as he got closer, becoming solid and real enough to support his weight as he climbed into the cab. She could hear the engine start up through her radio equipment, could see the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness as Tommy began following his familiar route around the pit. But when Elena tried to radio him, Tommy's response came through in a voice that sounded like it was being transmitted from years in the past, describing mining conditions and shift quotas that no longer existed, speaking as if the mine had never closed and he had never left. Elena's final report to federal authorities recommended immediate and permanent closure of all access to Bingham Canyon, but the phantom mining operations continue to this day. Current security footage shows that the ghostly night shifts have evolved beyond simple historical replays. They now include dozens of former employees who have returned to complete their eternal shifts, working alongside equipment that exists only during the hours of darkness, extracting phantom copper from deposits that were exhausted years ago. Local residents report hearing the sounds of heavy machinery and shift whistles echoing from the canyon every night, and missing person reports continue to accumulate as more former Bingham Canyon workers feel the inexplicable compulsion to return to their old jobs. Elena herself left Utah within a week of completing her investigation, but security cameras at her new home in Colorado have recently captured her standing in her driveway at night, staring in the direction of Bingham Canyon with the same purposeful expression that marked the other missing workers, as if something vast and industrial is calling her back to complete a shift that will never truly end. Story 3. Detective Ray Morrison had investigated 17 homicide cases during his 8 years with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, but the discovery that brought him to the abandoned Lost Creek mine in October 2023 would prove that some killers operate on timelines that defy human comprehension. The initial call came from a group of urban explorers who had been documenting abandoned mining sites across the Rocky Mountains for their YouTube channel. What they found in the deepest accessible tunnel of Lost Creek Mine wasn't just another relic of Colorado's mining past, but evidence of a methodical killer who had been perfecting his craft for decades in the labyrinthine darkness beneath the mountains. The explorers had discovered a chamber that had been carefully excavated beyond the original mining tunnels, containing the preserved remains of 11 victims arranged with surgical precision, each body showing identical preparation methods that suggested the work of someone with both extensive anatomical knowledge and unlimited time to perfect their technique. Dr. Sarah Kim had worked as a forensic anthropologist for the FBI for 12 years, specializing in cases involving multiple victims and extended timelines, but even her experience didn't prepare her for what Ray's investigation would reveal about the Lost Creek discoveries. Her initial examination of the remains confirmed that the victims spanned an impossible timeline. Carbon dating and forensic analysis indicated that the oldest remains were approximately 40 years old, while the most recent had been placed in the chamber within the past 6 months. What made this timeline truly horrifying was the identical nature of the preservation methods used on every victim across 4 decades. Each body showed the same precise incision patterns, the same careful organ removal and replacement techniques, and the same ritualistic positioning that suggested not just a single killer, but someone who had maintained exactly the same methods and mental state across an entire generation of victims. Ray's investigation into missing persons reports from the past 40 years revealed a pattern that made him question everything he thought he knew about serial killer behavior. Every 5 to 7 years since 1983, someone would disappear while hiking or camping in the Lost Creek area. Always experienced outdoors enthusiasts who knew the terrain well and wouldn't have gotten lost under normal circumstances. The victims fit no typical serial killer profile, ranging in age from their early 20s to their late 50s, including both men and women from diverse backgrounds and geographic locations. The only consistent element was their expertise in wilderness survival and their familiarity with abandoned mining sites, as if the killer was specifically targeting people who might venture deep enough into the mine system to discover his underground workspace. Dr. Kim's detailed analysis of the preservation techniques revealed knowledge that should have evolved over 40 years of practice, but instead showed an impossible consistency that suggested the killer had perfected his methods immediately and never deviated from his original approach. The surgical precision of the work required medical training that would typically improve and modernize over decades, yet the oldest remains showed exactly the same level of skill and exactly the same archaic techniques as the most recent victims. This consistency extended to the tools used for the preservation work. Microscopic analysis revealed that the same implements had been used on victims across the entire 40-year timeline, despite the fact that such intensive use should have worn out any surgical instruments decades ago. The breakthrough in Ray's investigation came when Dr. Kim discovered that several of the victims had left behind detailed journals and blog posts documenting their final hiking trips to the Lost Creek area. These accounts described encounters with an elderly miner who claimed to have worked the Lost Creek site during its operational period in the 1940s and 1950s, a man who offered to guide experienced hikers to unexplored sections of the mine system that weren't marked on any official maps. The descriptions of this elderly guide were remarkably consistent across 40 years of victim accounts. A tall, thin man with pale skin and dark eyes, wearing mining equipment that appeared authentic but showed no signs of wear or aging. Most disturbing of all, photographs included in some of the hiking blogs showed the same man across multiple decades, appearing to be exactly the same age in pictures taken 20 years apart. Ray's attempts to identify the mysterious guide through historical mining records revealed that a man matching his description had indeed worked at Lost Creek Mine, but had been reported missing in a cave-in accident in November 1957. According to the official incident report, Jeremiah Blackwood had been working alone in the deepest section of the mine when a structural collapse sealed him into a section of tunnels that were deemed too dangerous to excavate for rescue operations. The mine was officially abandoned 6 months later, with Blackwood's body never recovered and his death certificate listing him as presumed dead due to the cave-in. However, Ray's investigation revealed that people matching Blackwood's description had been guiding hikers into the Lost Creek mine system continuously since the 1960s, always using the same name and always claiming to have worked the mine during its operational period. Dr. Kim's final analysis of the underground chamber revealed the most terrifying aspect of the Lost Creek case. The preservation techniques used on the victims weren't intended to create trophies or satisfy typical serial killer psychology, but were methodical attempts to achieve something far more disturbing. The careful organ removal and replacement, the precise positioning of the bodies, and the ritualistic arrangement of the chamber suggested that Blackwood was attempting to preserve not just the physical remains of his victims, but their consciousness as well. Chemical analysis of the preservation compounds found traces of substances that shouldn't have been available to a 1950s miner, including modern neurological preservatives and compounds designed to maintain brain tissue viability far beyond normal death. Ray's investigation took a horrifying turn when he realized that the underground chamber wasn't just a killing ground, but a workshop, where Blackwood was perfecting techniques to extend his own existence by harvesting the life force of his carefully selected victims. The surgical precision of his work wasn't just about preservation. It was about transfer, using the vitality and knowledge of experienced outdoors enthusiasts to maintain his own unnatural longevity in the darkness beneath Lost Creek Mine. This explained the impossible consistency of his methods across 40 years, his unchanging physical appearance in victim photographs, and his supernatural knowledge of mining tunnels that had been sealed and forgotten for decades. The case reached its terrifying conclusion when Ray attempted to enter the Lost Creek mine system with a full tactical team to apprehend Blackwood. The team's descent into the deeper tunnels revealed that the underground chamber was just one of dozens of similar workspaces that Blackwood had carved out over the decades, each one containing evidence of his evolving techniques for harvesting and transferring human consciousness. The tactical team's body cameras recorded their encounter with Blackwood himself, a figure who appeared to be in his 30s despite being over 90 years old according to historical records, moving through the darkness with inhuman speed and displaying knowledge of the team's tactical procedures that he couldn't possibly have possessed. The final footage showed Blackwood speaking directly to Ray through the radio system, explaining that his preservation work was nearing completion and that he no longer needed to remain in the confines of the mine system. Ray Morrison's final report was classified immediately after submission, but leaked portions reveal that Blackwood disappeared from the Lost Creek mine sometime during the tactical operation, leaving behind evidence that he had been preparing for decades to emerge from his underground workshop and continue his preservation work in the outside world. Missing persons reports from across Colorado have since revealed a new pattern: experienced law enforcement officers and medical professionals disappearing while investigating abandoned mining sites, their expertise in human anatomy and criminal investigation making them perfect candidates for Blackwood's next phase of experimentation. Dr. Kim herself disappeared 3 weeks after completing her forensic analysis. Her final research notes describing her growing obsession with the preservation techniques and her belief that Blackwood's methods could be perfected to achieve true immortality for anyone willing to pay the price in human consciousness. Story 4. Jake Sullivan had explored over 200 abandoned buildings and mining sites across the Pacific Northwest during his 5 years as an urban explorer, documenting forgotten pieces of American industrial history for his growing online following. However, the assignment that brought him to Iron Mountain Mine in Northern California in November 2023 would be his final exploration, revealing something beneath the earth that challenged every assumption about life, death, and the true cost of extracting resources from the deepest places on the planet. Jake had been commissioned by a historical preservation society to document the mine's interior before it was permanently sealed as part of an environmental cleanup project. But what he discovered in the abandoned tunnels wasn't just industrial decay. It was evidence of something vast and alive that had been growing in the darkness for over a century, feeding on the miners who had disappeared during the facility's operational years. Professor Amanda Cross had spent 15 years studying extremophile organisms in hostile environments, but nothing in her academic career prepared her for Jake's initial footage from Iron Mountain Mine. His cameras had captured what appeared to be organic material growing along the tunnel walls, but the patterns and behavior of this growth defied classification within any known biological system. The material pulsed with a rhythmic motion that resembled breathing, expanding and contracting in coordinated waves that traveled through the tunnel system like a vast circulatory network. Most disturbing of all, the organic material appeared to respond to Jake's presence, with sections of the wall growth brightening and darkening in patterns that seemed almost communicative, as if something massive and intelligent was becoming aware of the human intruder in its domain. Jake's deeper penetration into the mine system revealed the true scope of what was growing beneath Iron Mountain. The organic material wasn't just coating the existing tunnel walls, it had consumed and replaced entire sections of the original mining infrastructure, incorporating wooden support beams, metal equipment, and even sections of railroad track into its biological matrix. The organism had transformed the abandoned mine into something resembling a vast internal organ, with tunnel passages that now functioned as arteries carrying nutrients through a living system that extended far beyond the original excavation boundaries. Jake's atmospheric readings showed oxygen levels that were actually higher in the deeper sections of the mine, as if the organism was producing breathable air as part of its metabolic processes. Professor Cross's analysis of Jake's biological samples revealed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about how life could evolve in isolated environments. The organism wasn't a single creature, but rather a complex symbiotic system that had incorporated the genetic material of everything it had consumed over the past century, including the miners who had disappeared during Iron Mountain's operational period. DNA analysis showed human genetic markers woven throughout the organism's cellular structure, suggesting that it hadn't simply consumed the missing miners, but had absorbed their biological information and integrated their consciousness into its own collective awareness. The organism had essentially become a living repository of every person who had ever died in the Iron Mountain mine system, their individual identities merged into something vast and alien, yet disturbingly human in its intelligence. Jake's final descent into the deepest accessible section of the mine brought him face to face with the organism's central consciousness, a massive chamber where the walls, ceiling, and floor had been completely replaced by pulsing organic material that glowed with its own bioluminescent light. His cameras recorded the chamber's response to his presence. sections of the organic material forming shapes that resembled human faces, dozens of them emerging from the living walls to watch Jake with eyes that retained disturbingly human expressions of curiosity and hunger. The faces belonged to miners from across Iron Mountain's operational history, their features preserved within the organism's biological matrix but transformed into something that was no longer entirely human. These integrated consciousnesses attempted to communicate with Jake, their voices emerging from the organic walls as whispered conversations about shifts that never ended, about becoming part of something larger and more permanent than individual human existence. The organism's attempt to integrate Jake into its collective consciousness began immediately upon his entry into the central chamber. Professor Cross's later analysis of his final recording showed that the organic material was releasing airborne spores designed to infiltrate human respiratory and nervous systems, beginning a conversion process that would gradually replace Jake's individual biology with cells from the collective organism. Jake's own voice in the recordings began to change as the integration process advanced, his speech patterns becoming more rhythmic and coordinated, matching the pulsing cadence of the organism's biological functions. Most terrifyingly, Jake began expressing ideas and memories that weren't his own, describing mining techniques from the 1920s and personal experiences from the lives of miners who had been absorbed into the organism decades before his birth. Professor Cross realized that the Iron Mountain organism represented an entirely new form of life, one that had evolved specifically to exploit the isolation and darkness of deep mining operations. The creature had likely begun as a simple extremophile colony in the mine's deepest sections, but had evolved over decades of feeding on organic material to become something far more complex and intelligent. Each miner it absorbed added to its knowledge base and processing power, allowing it to grow more sophisticated in its hunting and integration techniques. The organism had essentially become a living mine, using its absorbed human consciousness to understand and exploit the psychology of the explorers and workers who ventured into its domain. Jake's final transmission described his growing awareness of the organism's true intentions. It wasn't content to remain confined to the Iron Mountain mine system, but was preparing to expand its influence to other abandoned mining sites across the region. The collective consciousness of absorbed miners was providing it with detailed knowledge of tunnel systems, geological formations, and the locations of other abandoned mines where it could establish new colonies. Jake's own expertise in urban exploration was being integrated into this expansion plan, his knowledge of abandoned sites and exploration techniques making him a particularly valuable addition to the organism's collective intelligence. The Iron Mountain mine was sealed permanently 3 days after Jake's final transmission, but Professor Cross's ongoing monitoring has revealed that the organism's influence extends far beyond the original excavation boundaries. Seismic sensors detect rhythmic vibrations beneath abandoned mining sites across Northern California, suggesting that underground colonies are expanding and connecting through natural cave systems and groundwater networks. Most disturbing of all, recent reports from other urban explorers describe encounters with organic material in mines that should have no connection to Iron Mountain, indicating that the organism has successfully established satellite colonies and is continuing to integrate new human consciousness into its ever-growing collective awareness. Professor Cross herself disappeared 6 weeks after completing her analysis of the Iron Mountain organism, her final research notes describing her growing fascination with the creature's collective consciousness model and her belief that individual human existence was an evolutionary dead end compared to the immortal collective awareness that the organism offered. Security cameras at her laboratory captured her final night of research, showing her speaking to samples of the organic material as if conducting a conversation, her voice taking on the same rhythmic cadence that had marked Jake's final recordings. Her abandoned laboratory contained detailed maps of abandoned mining sites across the western United States, each location marked with notes about accessibility and the likelihood of successful organism colonization, suggesting that Professor Cross had become another willing recruiter for the Iron Mountain Collective's expansion across the underground networks that humanity had carved beneath the earth. Story 5. Isabella Romano had dedicated her career as a historical researcher to documenting the untold stories of America's industrial past, but the discovery that brought her to Shaft 19 of the abandoned Blackstone coal mine in Pennsylvania during December 2023 would reveal that some historical mysteries exist outside the normal flow of time itself. The case began when local authorities discovered the bodies of 3 recent murder victims in the sealed mine shaft, victims who had been reported missing from nearby towns within the past month. However, when Isabella arrived to research the historical context of the discovery site, she found something that challenged every assumption about linear time and the permanent nature of death. The murder victims were wearing authentic 1920s clothing, carrying personal items that had been manufactured nearly a century ago, and showing DNA evidence that linked them directly to families who had vanished during the mine's original operational period. Captain David Hayes of the Pennsylvania State Police had investigated hundreds of homicides during his 20-year career, but the forensic evidence from Shaft 19 created contradictions that made him question the reliability of modern investigative techniques. The 3 victims, Amanda Chen, Marcus Williams, and Sarah Rodriguez, had been reported missing from their respective hometowns between October and December-November 2023, with security camera footage and witness testimony confirming their presence in the modern world right up until their disappearances. However, the bodies recovered from Shaft 19 showed advanced decomposition consistent with deaths that had occurred in the 1920s, and carbon dating of their clothing and personal effects confirmed that these items had been manufactured and worn nearly a century ago, despite the fact that the victims themselves had been alive and living normal lives in the 21st century just weeks before their deaths. Isabella's research into the Blackstone mine's operational history revealed a pattern of disappearances that had been occurring in cycles since the facility's closure in 1929. Every 15 to 20 years, people would vanish from the surrounding communities under circumstances that defied explanation, always during the autumn months and always involving individuals who had no apparent connection to mining or the historical Blackstone site. The disappearances had been dismissed by local authorities as isolated incidents across the decades, but Isabella's comprehensive analysis revealed that each cycle of vanishings corresponded exactly with the anniversary dates of the original Blackstone mine disaster, when 37 miners had been trapped in Shaft 19 by a catastrophic cave-in that sealed them in the deepest section of the mine forever. Captain Hayes's investigation into the personal backgrounds of the 3 recent victims revealed connections that shouldn't have been possible given the timeline of their deaths. Amanda Chen's DNA analysis showed genetic markers that matched perfectly with the Chen family genealogical records from the 1920s, indicating that she was somehow the direct descendant of Li Chen, one of the miners who had died in the original Shaft 19 cave-in. Similarly, Marcus Williams' genetic profile linked him to the Williams mining family that had lost 2 sons in the 1929 disaster, while Sarah Rodriguez's DNA connected her to the Rodriguez family whose patriarch had been among the trapped miners. These genetic connections suggested that the recent victims weren't random targets, but had been specifically selected based on their ancestral links to the original Blackstone mine tragedy. Isabella's deeper investigation into the 1929 cave-in revealed details that had been suppressed from official mining records, details that suggested the disaster hadn't been an accident, but rather the result of the miners' discovery of something ancient and malevolent in the deepest sections of Shaft 19. Personal letters and diary entries from the miners' families described increasingly disturbed behavior in the weeks leading up to the cave-in, with the trapped workers reporting strange dreams where they experienced the lives and memories of people from different time periods. The miners claimed to be seeing visions of future generations of their own families, describing in remarkable detail the lives and appearances of descendants who wouldn't be born for decades. Most disturbing of all, These visions always ended with the future family members joining the miners in the darkness of Shaft 19, completing some kind of temporal cycle that transcended normal death and rebirth. Captain Hayes's forensic team discovered that the recent victims' bodies showed evidence of experiences that predated their modern births by nearly a century. Medical examination revealed old injuries, scarring patterns, and even occupational wear on their hands that was consistent with decades of coal mining work, despite the fact that none of the 3 victims had ever worked in industrial labor. More impossibly, their lung tissue showed the characteristic damage pattern of prolonged coal dust exposure, and chemical analysis of their bloodstreams revealed trace elements that were specific to the particular coal seam that had been mined in Shaft 19 during the 1920s. The victims had somehow lived full lives as 1920s coal miners before being born into their modern identities, carrying the physical evidence of those historical experiences within their contemporary bodies. Isabella's research revealed that the Blackstone mine had been built on a site that local Native American tribes had considered cursed long before European settlers arrived in the region. Tribal oral histories described the area as a place where time moved differently, where the spirits of the dead could reach across generations to claim their descendants and complete unfinished business in the physical world. The mining operation had apparently disturbed something that existed outside normal temporal boundaries, creating a cycle where the original trapped miners could pull their future descendants back through time to join them in their eternal imprisonment beneath the earth. The case reached its horrifying conclusion when Isabella realized that her own genealogical research had revealed her connection to the original Blackstone disaster. Her great-grandfather had been Francesco Romano, the mine foreman who had led the rescue efforts after the 1929 cave-in. Isabella's growing obsession with the case began to affect her perception of time and identity, as she experienced increasingly vivid dreams where she lived as Francesco Romano, making the desperate decisions that had ultimately failed to save the trapped miners. Captain Hayes noticed that Isabella's behavior was becoming erratic, and her speech patterns were adopting the cadences and expressions of someone from the 1920s, as if her ancestral connection to the disaster was allowing the past to overwrite her present identity. Isabella's final research notes described her growing awareness that the Shaft 19 cycle wasn't random, but was systematically working through the family lines of everyone who had been connected to the original mining disaster. The temporal disturbance created by the cave-in had trapped not just the 37 miners, but had created a gravitational pull that would eventually claim every descendant of every person who had been involved in the Blackstone mine operation. Isabella calculated that hundreds of people across multiple generations were connected to the disaster through family lines, employment records, or community involvement, and that the cycle would continue claiming victims every 15 to 20 years until every genealogical connection had been resolved through death and absorption into the temporal anomaly centered in Shaft 19. Captain Hayes found Isabella's body in Shaft 19 3 days after her final research entry, but the forensic evidence defied every protocol and scientific principle he had learned during his career. Isabella's remains showed decomposition consistent with a death that had occurred in the 1920s, and she was wearing authentic period clothing that matched the mining company uniforms worn by supervisory personnel during the Blackstone operation. Most impossibly, the crime scene included a handwritten note in Isabella's handwriting, dated 1929, describing her final moments as Francesco Romano, trying to dig through the cave-in to reach the trapped miners. The note ended with a warning that the temporal cycle could only be broken by sealing Shaft 19 permanently with concrete and steel, preventing any future descendants from approaching the site where past and present had become fatally entangled in an endless loop of death and rebirth that reached across a century to claim the lives of people who had never been born when the original disaster occurred. Story 6. Alex Park had worked as a telecommunications engineer for Verizon for 8 years, specializing in signal anomaly detection and cellular tower diagnostics, But the assignment that brought him to the Devil's Throat mine in Nevada during January 2024 would expose him to technology that defied every principle of modern communication systems. The case began when cell phone towers across a 50-mile radius started receiving signals from a source located deep within the abandoned copper mine, signals that were transmitting on frequencies that had been discontinued decades ago, yet were somehow interfacing perfectly with modern cellular networks. These weren't just random electronic noise or equipment malfunctions. The signals contained coherent voice communications, text messages, and even video calls from people who claimed to be trapped in underground facilities that couldn't possibly exist within the sealed mine system. Sheriff Maria Santos had served Nye County for 15 years, dealing with everything from tourist accidents to illegal mining operations. But nothing in her experience prepared her for the rescue calls that started flooding the emergency dispatch system in late December 2023. The calls were coming from cell phones with numbers that had been disconnected years ago, from people who identified themselves using names that matched missing persons reports dating back to the 1980s and 1990s. Most disturbing of all, the callers provided detailed descriptions of their location that matched the internal layout of Devil's Throat mine with impossible accuracy, describing sections of the facility that had been sealed and flooded during the mine's closure in 1978. The callers seemed unaware that decades had passed since their disappearances, referring to current events from their original time periods and expressing confusion about why rescue teams hadn't arrived to help them escape from the underground complex where they claimed to be imprisoned. Alex's technical analysis of the signal transmissions revealed that the communications were originating from a depth of over 1,200 feet within the Devil's Throat mine system, far below the deepest sections that had ever been excavated during the facility's operational period. Even more impossible, the signal strength and clarity suggested that sophisticated cellular relay equipment was operating in the underground location, equipment that would have required massive power sources and regular maintenance to function in the harsh conditions beneath the Nevada desert. The transmitted calls included GPS coordinates that placed the callers' locations within solid rock formations that geological surveys confirmed had never been disturbed by mining operations. Yet the voice communications included detailed descriptions of artificial lighting, ventilation systems, and electronic equipment that would be necessary to sustain human life in such an environment. Sheriff Santos assembled a specialized rescue team to investigate the source of the underground communications, but their initial descent into the accessible sections of Devil's Throat mine revealed only the expected industrial decay and flooding that had been documented during the facility's closure 46 years earlier. However, the rescue team's radio equipment began picking up the mysterious cellular transmissions with increasing clarity as they descended deeper into the mine system, and the conversations they monitored painted a picture of an underground facility that was far more extensive and technologically advanced than anything that could have been constructed during the mine's operational period in the 1960s and 1970s. The trapped individuals described working in laboratories and workshops equipped with computers and communication systems that wouldn't be invented until decades after the mine's official closure. Alex's breakthrough came when he realized that the cellular signals weren't being transmitted from the past, but were somehow being received from the future. The underground communications were coming from a version of Devil's Throat mine that had been developed far beyond its historical operational capacity. The technical specifications described in the transmitted conversations included references to cellular technology, computer systems, and power generation methods that were decades ahead of anything available in the 1970s, when the mine was supposedly abandoned. The trapped individuals were describing a facility that had been continuously developed and expanded in secret, using mining tunnels as the foundation for an underground complex that had grown far beyond the original excavation boundaries. Sheriff Santos's investigation revealed that Devil's Throat mine had never actually been abandoned in 1978, but had been sold to a classified government contractor who had used the existing tunnel system as the foundation for an underground research facility. Official records had been falsified to show the mine as closed and flooded, while in reality, the facility had been expanded continuously for over 40 years, developing into a massive underground complex dedicated to experimental research projects that required absolute isolation from outside observation. The cellular transmissions were coming from researchers and support staff who had been working in the facility for decades, completely cut off from the outside world and unaware that their isolation had been intended as permanent rather than temporary. Alex's analysis of the communication patterns revealed that the underground facility had been conducting experiments in temporal manipulation and reality distortion, research that had somehow created a communication bridge between different time periods within the same physical location. The trapped researchers were simultaneously living in multiple temporal states. They experienced their work in the underground facility as continuous across decades, but they also existed in fragmented time periods where they repeatedly lived through their original assignments without awareness that time was passing in the outside world. Their cellular communications were reaching the surface across multiple temporal layers, creating the impression that people from different decades were all simultaneously trapped in the same location. The true horror of the Devil's Throat situation became apparent when Alex realized that the underground facility was still actively expanding, using technologies that had been developed through decades of isolated research to burrow deeper into the Nevada desert and create new sections of the complex that existed partially outside normal space-time. The trapped researchers had become unwilling test subjects in experiments that blurred the boundaries between past, present, and future. Their consciousness scattered across multiple temporal states while their bodies remained imprisoned in an underground maze that grew larger and more complex with each passing year. Sheriff Santos's final attempt to reach the underground facility ended in disaster when her rescue team's descent triggered a temporal anomaly that pulled them into the same multidimensional trap that had been holding the original researchers for decades. Alex's monitoring equipment recorded their final transmissions as they described being welcomed by colleagues who claimed to have been expecting their arrival for years, despite the fact that the rescue mission had been planned just hours earlier. The rescue team's cellular signals continued transmitting for weeks after their disappearance, describing their integration into research projects that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, their voices becoming increasingly disconnected from linear time as they adapted to existence within the temporal distortions that kept the Devil's Throat facility hidden from the outside world. Alex Park disappeared 3 months after completing his technical analysis of the Devil's Throat communications, his final equipment readings showing massive signal amplification from the underground facility that suggested the temporal research had achieved a breakthrough that would allow the trapped consciousness of the researchers to extend their influence beyond the physical boundaries of the mine system. Current cellular tower monitoring continues to detect communications from Devil's Throat Mine, but now the transmissions include Alex's voice among the trapped researchers, describing telecommunications projects that span multiple decades simultaneously, and warning that the facility's temporal manipulation experiments are approaching a critical phase that will allow the underground complex to begin influencing surface reality across multiple time periods, essentially making the entire Nevada desert into an extension of the multidimensional prison that has been growing beneath Devil's Throat Mine for over 40 years. Story 7. Father Miguel Hernandez had served the remote communities of Montana for over 20 years, providing spiritual guidance and comfort to families dealing with tragedies both natural and inexplicable. But the events that brought him to the abandoned Moonlight mine in February 2024 would challenge his faith in ways that no theological training could have prepared him for. The case began when local ranchers reported that their livestock were refusing to graze in areas near the old mine site, displaying signs of terror and distress whenever they were brought within a mile of the abandoned facility. More disturbing were the reports from hunters and hikers who described seeing dark, humanoid figures emerging from the ground near the mine entrance during the pre-dawn hours, figures that moved with unnatural coordination and seemed to be climbing upward through solid rock as if the earth itself was nothing more than water to be swum through. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had worked as a seismologist for the United States Geological Survey for 12 years, specializing in underground geological formations and subsurface anomaly detection. But the readings she obtained from the Moonlight mine area defied every principle of earth science she had learned during her career. Her ground-penetrating radar equipment detected distinct humanoid shapes moving through solid granite at depths of over 500 feet. Shapes that were ascending toward the surface at a rate of approximately 3 feet per day in perfect vertical columns that showed no regard for existing rock formations or geological barriers. Even more impossible, seismic monitoring revealed that these ascending figures were creating their own pathways through the bedrock, somehow dissolving solid stone ahead of their movement and then allowing it to resolidify behind them as they passed through. Father Miguel's involvement in the case began when several local families sought his counsel about nightmares that had been plaguing their children for months, nightmares that shared disturbing similarities despite the fact that the affected families lived miles apart and had no communication with each other. The children described dreams where dark figures with glowing eyes were calling to them from beneath the ground, promising them eternal safety and companionship in underground chambers that were described in remarkably consistent detail. Most troubling of all, the children claimed that these figures were getting closer to the surface each night, and that they could feel the presence of the ascending entities even during their waking hours, as if something vast and ancient was reaching upward through the earth to touch their minds with promises of escape from the loneliness and pain of human existence. Dr. Walsh's detailed geological analysis of the Moonlight mine area revealed that the ascending figures were following pathways that corresponded exactly with the original mine shaft layouts from the facility's operational period in the early 1900s, but they were moving through sections of the underground system that had been completely filled with concrete and steel during the mine's closure in 1923. Historical records indicated that Moonlight Mine had been sealed permanently after a catastrophic accident that had trapped 43 miners in the deepest sections of the facility, but the official incident reports had been heavily redacted and contained inconsistencies that suggested the true nature of the disaster had been deliberately obscured by both the mining company and local authorities. Father Miguel's research into the spiritual history of the Moonlight Mine area uncovered Native American tribal legends that described the site as a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead had been damaged by human greed and industrial exploitation. According to these oral traditions, the original mining operation had broken through into underground chambers that served as a prison for entities that had been banished from the surface world thousands of years ago. Entities that fed on human despair and loneliness by offering false promises of eternal community and belonging. The tribal elders had warned early settlers to avoid the area, claiming that digging too deeply would release these malevolent spirits and allow them to begin their slow ascent back to the surface world where they could once again prey upon human souls. Dr. Walsh's seismic monitoring revealed that the ascending figures had begun to accelerate their upward movement in recent weeks, and her calculations indicated that they would breach the surface within days of her initial measurements. More disturbing was her discovery that the figures weren't moving randomly, but were coordinating their ascent to emerge simultaneously at multiple locations across a wide area surrounding the original mine site. Ground-penetrating radar showed that dozens of humanoid shapes were rising through the bedrock in a pattern that would allow them to surface at strategic points near local homes, schools, and community gathering places, as if they had been studying the area's population distribution and planning their emergence to maximize their contact with potential victims. Father Miguel's attempt to perform a spiritual cleansing of the Moonlight mine site revealed the true nature of the entities that were ascending through the earth toward the surface. His prayers and blessed water had no effect on the geological anomalies, but they did trigger a psychic response from the rising figures that manifested as voices speaking directly into his mind. Voices that claimed to be the original trapped miners who had discovered a way to transcend death and achieve eternal existence by merging their consciousness with something ancient and powerful that had been waiting in the deepest chambers beneath the mine. These voices described their 43 trapped colleagues not as victims of an industrial accident, but as willing converts who had embraced transformation into entities that existed partially outside physical reality, entities that had spent a century preparing for their return to the surface world. The case reached its terrifying climax when the ascending figures began to emerge from the ground, exactly as Dr. Walsh's calculations had predicted, but their appearance defied both scientific explanation and religious understanding. The entities that broke through the earth near Moonlight Mine retained humanoid shapes but were composed of a substance that seemed to absorb light and shadow simultaneously, creating forms that were visible yet somehow existed in spaces between normal matter. Father Miguel's attempts to confront these emerging entities revealed that they possessed the memories and personalities of the original trapped miners, but their consciousness had been expanded and twisted by their century of imprisonment, with whatever ancient presence they had discovered in the deepest chambers of the mine. Dr. Walsh disappeared during the first night of the entity's emergence, her final seismic readings showing that the ground beneath her monitoring station had somehow become permeable, allowing her to sink into the earth as if she were being pulled down by invisible hands. Her equipment continued transmitting data for hours after her disappearance, recording her voice as she described being welcomed into an underground community of transformed consciousness where individual identity was preserved, but enhanced through connection to a collective awareness that transcended normal human limitations. Her final transmissions described the ascending entities not as invaders, but as recruiters gathering people who were ready to abandon the isolation and suffering of surface existence in favor of eternal community in the spaces between solid matter and empty air. Father Miguel's final report to church authorities described his growing realization that the Moonlight Mine entities represented a form of salvation that was both genuine and damnable, offering real escape from human suffering through transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. The ascending figures continued to emerge across the Montana countryside for weeks after the initial breakthrough, approaching isolated individuals with offers of community and belonging that were almost impossible to refuse, especially for people who had been struggling with loneliness, depression, or despair. Father Miguel himself began to experience the psychic contact from the transformed miners, their voices describing an underground realm where consciousness existed in perfect harmony, and where the pain and isolation of individual existence were replaced by eternal connection to a vast network of minds that had chosen transformation over death. His final journal entry expressed his growing temptation to accept their invitation, to allow himself to sink into the earth and join the ascending community that offered everything his faith had promised but never quite delivered: eternal life, perfect understanding, and complete escape from the suffering that defined human existence on the surface of a world that seemed increasingly hostile to hope and spiritual connection.